Tuna and you're watching A News. Let's take a look at today's top stories. Israel recovers the body of the last hostage in Gaza, a development Netanyahu is calling a great achievement. Trump threatens to impose new tariffs on South Korea over trade deal delays. And India and the European Union have sealed a landmark trade deal, ending nearly 20 years of negotiations. Israel says it has recovered the body of the last hostage held in Gaza, a step that could pave the way for a US-backed plan to rebuild and demilitarize the territory.
Israel says the body of the last slain Israeli hostage, Ran Gvili, has been recovered from Gaza by the Israeli army. On Monday, the remains of the police officer and Special Forces veteran were formally identified, ending the search for the final hostage held since the Hamas-led attack on Israel on October 7, 2023. The Israeli military began searching a cemetery in Gaza on Sunday after Hamas's armed wing said it had shared details of Gvili's location with mediators. His return fulfills a key requirement of the first phase of US President Donald Trump's peace plan. Gvili had been held for more than 840 days. Israeli officials say the recovery brings long-awaited closure to his family and marks the end of Israel's hostage ordeal. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the operation an extraordinary achievement, praising Israeli forces and crediting President Trump with helping secure the release of 20 living hostages earlier under the ceasefire agreement. Speaking in Jerusalem, Netanyahu described Gvili as a hero who continued fighting despite severe injuries before being killed.
But then we had to get another 28 deceased hostages. And we got them all out, and there remained one, Ran Gvili. Ran Gvili, from the special unit in the police, who fought not only with a broken arm. He was shot twice, and he kept fighting. And he killed 14 terrorists alone. And then he died. And we said we'd bring him back. He was the first to come in. He's the last to leave, a hero of Israel. Rani is back. There are no more hostages in Gaza. Tremendous achievement for our heroic forces, our soldiers, our commanders. None like them.
In Tel Aviv, crowds gathered at what has become known as Hostages Square, expressing a mix of sorrow, relief, and cautious hope.
One thing I know, peace. Peace. And that's what we should do. I don't know how, I don't know the way. It's the most complicated thing ever, but there's no way to proceed otherwise. We need a solution, and it must be something solid and sustainable, and if we won't believe it, it will never happen.
Israeli officials say the return of hostages' body could allow the limited reopening of Gaza's Rafah border crossing with Egypt. A US-backed committee says the crossing may open this week, though Israel has not confirmed a timeline. The next phase of the plan would focus on rebuilding and fully demilitarizing Gaza, including disarming Hamas, deploying an international stabilization force, and gradually withdrawing Israeli troops. Under President Trump's proposal, Hamas fighters who give up their weapons and commit to peace could receive amnesty, while others would be offered safe passage out of Gaza.
The US has announced it's raising tariffs on South Korean imports to 25%, accusing Seoul of not living up to a trade deal reached last year. The move has unsettled markets and prompted protests in South Korea, while questions remain over when the new duties will take effect. Here's more on that story.
Tariffs.
US President Donald Trump has announced a sharp rise in tariffs on South Korean imports, accusing Seoul's parliament of failing to honor a trade agreement with Washington. In a post on social media on Monday, Trump said tariffs on South Korean imports would be raised from 15 to 25%. He claimed South Korea's legislature had not passed what he called a historic trade deal, despite earlier commitments. Trump said the tariffs would apply to cars, lumber and pharmaceutical products. The announcement rattled markets in South Korea. Auto shares fell sharply in early trading on Tuesday before recovering some ground. South Koreans voiced their anger over President Trump's tariff hike, with a small group of protesters gathering outside the US Embassy in Seoul on Tuesday. Wearing Trump's masks and holding banners, they denounced the United States and what they described as interference in domestic affairs.
The United States under a second Trump term is really going too far. In South Korea, our laws require public consultation, bipartisan deliberation, and an assessment of whether a measure makes commercial sense. Yet the United States has already unilaterally stated that South Korea's $200 billion investment would go to a nuclear plant in Alaska without going through any investment committee or consultative bodies. This is an act that betrays international good faith and violates basic treaties and the principles of the United Nations. It undermines international law. I urge Trump to stop interfering in South Korea's internal affairs and violating our sovereignty.
Seoul had been working to implement a deal announced in November that was expected to reduce US tariffs on South Korean exports. With all these developments, it remains unclear when the new tariffs will take effect. Analysts say trade terms had already been agreed at presidential level, raising questions over what prompted Trump's latest decision.
Some US federal immigration agents are expected to leave Minneapolis today as pressure mounts after a fatal shooting of an intensive care nurse, Alex Pretty, over the weekend. There's been growing backlash against the administration's immigration crackdown, and an investigation into the shooting is currently underway. Here's more on that story.
Federal immigration authorities are beginning to scale back their presence in Minneapolis after days of public anger and political pressure. Officials say Gregory Bovino, a senior Border Patrol commander who led the federal deployment in the city, is expected to leave Minnesota along with some agents as early as Tuesday. Bovino became a central figure in the crackdown and drew heavy criticism after publicly defending the fatal shooting of 37-year-old intensive care nurse Alex Pretty by Border Patrol officers. City and federal officials have offered sharply different accounts of what led to the shooting, which remains under investigation. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey says he spoke directly with President Donald Trump, urging an end to the enforcement surge. He says Trump agreed the situation could not continue and confirmed that some officers would begin withdrawing. Trump later confirmed the call, saying progress was being made. The White House has defended its immigration policy, but described Pretty's death as a tragedy.
Nobody in the White House, including President Trump, wants to see people getting hurt or killed in America's streets. This includes Renee Good, Alex Pretty, the brave men and women of federal law enforcement, and the many Americans who have been victimized at the hands of illegal alien criminals. Saturday's shooting remains under active investigation by Homeland Security Investigations and the FBI. The Customs and Border Protection is also conducting their own internal review.
Protests have continued across Minnesota, including on university campuses. Students at the University of Minnesota staged walkouts and rallies, calling for immigration agents to leave the city.
None of us are going to stop, and we showed up in sub-zero temperatures to show that, and we're not going to stop. It's only going to get easier as it warms up. And the Twin Cities belong to us. It doesn't belong to them, and together we're going to take it back. And I've seen the community come together, and when that happens, I know we're going to get them out, and I know that's the only way this ends.
Federal officials say immigration operations in Minnesota will now be overseen by Trump's border czar Tom Homan, as Homeland Security and FBI investigations into the shooting continue.
Ukraine says talks with Russia could resume as early as Sunday following US-mediated discussions in Abu Dhabi. President Volodymyr Zelensky says Kyiv is ready to move forward, while Moscow urges caution and Washington insists it remains engaged in the peace process.
Talks between Ukrainian and Russian negotiators are expected to resume on Sunday following US-mediated discussions in Abu Dhabi. Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine is ready to continue negotiations and suggested the next round could take place even sooner. Zelensky said the latest talks included a rare trilateral format with the United States and Russia.
Потрібні реальні результати дипломатії, щоб не було враження, що
Some issues need to be prepared for the next meeting. We previously discussed that the teams would meet again on Sunday. It would be good if this meeting could be sped up. After a long time, there was again a format with the Americans and Russians. They managed to discuss various issues of a more military nature, those concerning steps to end the war and real control and monitoring.
операції, все це працює на зупинку війни.
Moscow has downplayed expectations, saying the process is still at an early stage.
It's not a time to draw conclusions, even preliminary ones. This is only the beginning of the work. We are talking about the work at the expert level, and it will continue.
In Washington, the White House said President Donald Trump remains engaged in the peace effort, despite no immediate plans for direct calls.
Talks. They had a multilateral meeting this past weekend, which didn't get a ton of coverage, but that was historic in nature, where the president's team has really brought two sides of this war to the table together to move the ball closer towards peace. So the president is not giving up on the peace process.
Meanwhile, President Volodymyr Zelensky has signed a law extending martial law and mobilization in Ukraine until May 4th, with authorities saying the measures would remain in force even under a ceasefire.
Russian drone and missile strikes have hit several Ukrainian cities, leaving large areas without electricity and damaging civilian buildings as freezing winter conditions continue. Authorities say air defence remains active and repair crews are working amid ongoing threats.
Russian drone and missile strikes have hit several Ukrainian cities overnight, knocking out power and damaging civilian buildings during sub-zero winter conditions. In Kharkiv, authorities say strikes cut electricity to around 80% of the city and surrounding region. Apartment buildings, a school and a kindergarten were hit and 2 people were injured. Officials say repair crews are working under the threat of further air raids. In Kryvyi Rih, a drone strike hit a high-rise apartment building, triggering a fire. Local officials say residents were evacuated and no casualties were reported. In Kyiv, authorities reported enemy drones flying over the capital on Monday with no immediate reports of damage or injuries. Ukraine's military says fighting intensified along the front lines, while Russia says it carried out strikes on energy and military-related infrastructure across several regions.
India and the European Union have taken a major step in strengthening economic ties after finalising a long-awaited trade deal. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Antonio Costa met Prime Minister Narendra Modi in New Delhi following the agreement. Prime Minister Modi said the deal ends nearly 2 decades of negotiations and will open India's closely protected market to free trade with the 27-nation European Union. The EU is India's largest trading partner, with trade totalling more than $136 billion last year. The deal reflects growing global efforts to diversify trade amid uncertainty in relations with the United States. China has signalled its willingness to deepen cooperation with Finland. President Xi Jinping met Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo in Beijing today, calling for stronger mutual trust, improved communication and closer cooperation between the two countries. Prime Minister Orpo is on an official visit to China from the 25th to the 28th of January, holding talks with the Chinese leadership. According to China's state news agency Xinhua, President Xi said China is ready to work with Finland to uphold the international system centred on the United Nations. Xi said he hopes Finland can help improve relations between China and the EU. It's a great honor. Hong Kong has intensified health screening at its airport following reports of Nipah virus cases in India. Authorities say enhanced checks are in place for incoming passengers as a precaution, while stressing there are no local cases and the overall risk remains low. Our correspondent Mahnur Maktoum has more.
Hong Kong has tightened health surveillance at its airports after reports of a cluster of Nipah virus infections in India, as authorities move to prevent any potential importation of the disease. The Centre for Health Protection said it's closely monitoring the situation and has enhanced screening measures for inbound travelers, especially those arriving from affected areas, as a precautionary public health step. Under the heightened measures, airport staff are carrying out temperature checks, health assessments and on-site medical evaluations for passengers displaying symptoms consistent with infection. Suspected cases would be immediately referred to public hospitals for isolation and further investigation. The CSP said it's maintaining close communication with the World Health Organization and Indian health authorities to track developments and update its risk assessment. Nipah virus is a zoonotic disease carried mainly by fruit bats and can spread to humans through direct contact with infected animals, contaminated food, or in some cases, person-to-person transmission. The virus can cause severe respiratory illness and fatal brain inflammation, and there is currently no approved vaccine or specific treatment. Hong Kong health officials said no local or imported cases have been detected so far and the overall risk remains low, but urged the public to stay vigilant and seek medical attention if symptoms develop after travel to affected regions. Manu Mathing, News, Beijing.
USA rare earth shares surged after the company announced fresh backing from the US government. Washington says the investment is aimed at cutting reliance on China for critical minerals. Our correspondent Kate Fisher has more.
Well, USA rare earth stock soared to 29% at its height on Monday before closing at a gain of around 8%. That's $26.72 per share. Its CEO, Barbara Humpton, saying that this debt and equity deal with the US government would essentially turn USA rare earths into an industry leader. Now, rare earth elements are a category of critical minerals, and they're needed for basically everything we need in modern day life, from electronics, cars to defence. So they're used to make everything from a smartphone to an F-35 fighter jet. And the company says it's going to use this investment to really put money towards accelerating its mining, processing and metal making and its magnet manufacturing in Oklahoma and in Texas. At the moment, the US imports 80% of its rare earth demands from China, which is the country that dominates the world in this, both in production and processing. And last year, though, Beijing put export controls on its critical minerals, part of the negotiations with Washington over tariffs. And so the US government is doing all it can to try to make the US self-sufficient. And in a statement released by the company, the US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick was quoted as saying that USA rare earth heavy critical minerals project is essential to restoring US critical minerals independence, and that this investment ensures supply chains are resilient and no longer reliant on foreign nations. And indeed, the Trump administration, as I say, is pouring money into production domestically, but also into forging partnerships with its allies over production, countries like Indonesia, Australia, and Japan. But experts say despite all this, it could be years before the US is self-reliant when it comes to these critical minerals. At the moment, there is only one rare earths mine functional in the United States. And this project that the government has just invested in with USA Rare Earth, well, that project in Texas is unlikely to be operational until 2028. Kate Fisher for A News in Washington, D.C.
Venezuela's National Assembly is moving to approve changes to the country's oil law. As interim president Delcy Rodriguez says, investment in oil projects is expected to rise from nearly $900 million last year to around $1.4 billion in 2026 under production sharing contracts.
Venezuela's National Assembly is fast-tracking changes to the country's oil law aimed at opening the sector to more private and foreign investment. The reforms are being pushed by acting President Delcy Rodriguez, who says the move is needed to attract capital and raise production. Speaking in Caracas, Rodriguez said investment under production-sharing contracts is expected to rise sharply this year.
We currently have 29 production participation contracts signed. Last year, investment was almost $900 million, and this year it is projected to reach $1.4 billion.
Rodriguez rejected criticism from US officials, but said Venezuela remains open to relations with Washington based on mutual respect. The proposed reform would weaken the long-standing monopoly of state oil company PDVSA, giving partners more control over operations and oil sales. US officials say sanctions could be eased if political conditions are met, though industry executives say deeper reforms would still be needed.
We'll take a short break now, and when we return, we'll examine the latest developments in trilateral peace negotiations between Russia, Ukraine and the US, and what lies ahead. Stay with us.
Inside Politics delves deeply into the heart of global issues shaping our world today. Join me for your go-to source of political analysis from across the region and beyond.
Welcome back to A News. The United States, Ukraine and Russia are preparing for a third round of peace talks in Abu Dhabi after earlier trilateral negotiations were described as constructive. Though no breakthrough was reached, and both Kyiv and Moscow have reaffirmed their positions on territorial issues, particularly over the Donbass, which continues to be a core sticking point in any potential settlement. To discuss, let's bring in our guest, Gustavo de Aristegui, former diplomat, joining us from Tokyo, Japan. Ambassador, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
So after the 2 days of talks, both sides described as constructive, why is a third round in Abu Dhabi still needed? What's changed since the last session? How much do we know about what was discussed?
Well, we know that there has been some progress and that there is a fundamental change in the position of the United States vis-a-vis the security assurances for Ukraine. And that is that they are no longer demanding to give up its territorial claims to regain, to reclaim, to reconquer, to get their sovereignty back on the territory that was illegally seized by Russia. Second, we do know is that this is it's going to be the third time is a face-to-face meeting between the two warring factions. This is an extremely important step. It's not a minor thing. The tensions, the hatred, and the resentment is flying high, and it's going to take decades, if not more, for the Russian and Ukrainian peoples to actually forgive each other, to be able to reconcile, and to have a normal bilateral relation, social or between countries. The third thing that is important to determine is that right now, what we have been seeing, both parties are putting on the table, at the negotiation table, their red lines, what the exact limit of their positions, what they are not willing to give up. Of course, there's going to have to be some kind of sessions from one side and the other for the negotiation to advance. Of course, the Russian side is very keen on keeping everything that they have gained since 2014 and not giving up a single square kilometer. And this is the reason why they have been continuing the offensive since the present US administration went into power, into office, and said that they were going to intervene in trying to secure a peace deal, not a ceasefire. Because as you know, there is a big difference between what was negotiated in Gaza, which was a ceasefire, and this, which is a comprehensive peace deal, according to President Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And lastly, the most important thing that we will probably see in this third round is exactly the clear positions of one country and the other of how far they could be willing to go to start a comprehensive and meaningful discussion. Because right now they have just disagreed. They have just agreed that to disagree, and they are not even agreeing on what they disagree. If you don't mind me using this play of words.
Okay, Ambassador, so the first point, the first fundamental change there you mentioned was the security assurances by the US for Ukraine, saying that they don't have to make territorial concessions, whereas they were saying that before. How did this go down with Russia?
Well, I don't think that they have a choice here. It was very much in the psyche of the American administration, probably driven by not being too aware of the real repercussions of such a position. You know, when you go into government, even if you are an experienced politician, but you are not aware of the intricacies of international geopolitical consequences that your position can have on a global situation, peace, stability, security for the globe in its entirety. So I do think that in many ways, the most balanced and reasonable positions within the State Department, the National Security Council, which are both headed by the same person for the first time since Henry Kissinger, and that is former Senator Marco Rubio, who is both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, which, by the way, is a big advantage. And if you see that normally there was very frequently a clash between the State Department and the National Security Advisor's team, because normally the National Security Advisor has a much more, let's call it immediate and urgency, if you want to, for lack of a better expression, to get things done. And normally the State Department is more resilient to that kind of urgency, and they want to get things done in the classical diplomatic way. So right now, both teams are very much on the same page, and this is going to help a lot the negotiations. And this is probably the reason why you have seen a change in the United States in a reasonable way.
Okay, Ambassador, the sides are inching towards a ceasefire on the one hand, with ongoing attacks continuing and internal pressures on the other. How constrained is Kyiv really in what it can realistically offer or accept during these negotiations and talks?
You see, there are three basic elements that are going to be very complicated for the President Zelensky's administration to overcome if it is inevitable to make any kind of concession. First, it's going to be the military establishment. They are not going to take it easily. They are not going to accept that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have lost their lives basically for nothing. Second, there's going to be an outcry in the Ukrainian society. People that have suffered for years and years the atrocities of war and have seen their loved ones lose their lives, lose their household goods, their businesses, their livelihoods, everything. And they will not be easily convinced that these painful concessions need to be made. And thirdly, there is, of course, the political opposition that exists, even if we tend to forget about it in Ukraine, that will jump on this fiercely to criticize President Zelensky and even maybe call him a traitor. There has been even some rattling of sabers when the talk of concessions was circling in political circles in Kiev something that has done right, because President Zelensky has never spoken about concessions, has been extremely adamant about keeping his ground and being firm in the positions that Ukraine has been defending so far. So I do think that what you are going to be seeing now is that some kind of concession will have to be made. I'm not saying that, you know, everything that has been illegally conquered by Russia in the Donbas region, and especially those places that are close to the sources of critical raw materials and rare earths. But what I can probably assure you 100% is that the Russians will never give up the Crimean Peninsula, sorry, and that the Ukrainians will never accept giving the entirety of Donbas. So this is where I think that the red lines are.
Okay, and Ambassador, as you said, one of the most important breakthroughs here is that the two sides have agreed to sit at the table now. Well, Moscow has agreed. Is Moscow using diplomacy to buy time on the battlefield, or is this generally what we're looking at is a genuine exploration of a settlement path? How can we tell the difference?
Well, I don't think we can, and I think that you're very right in both points. Russia knows that it's running out of time. They already know which was their debt. This document that was published by many media around the world, and that I have spoken about in your show in the past, which is the FSB urging President Putin not to accept any kind of peace deal before 2026. Okay, we are in 2026, but they truly believe the longer the war lasts, and they have probably more cannon fodder, allow me such a terrible expression, to use such a terrible expression, than the Ukrainians have. The Ukrainians are very sensitive to the loss of their soldiers. It is a national tragedy. The Russian regime is a different kind of regime. They have a strict hold and control of the society and public opinion, and they can continue sending young Russians to the front and to die. So they do think that dragging their feet well into February or maybe even March, consolidating their positions in the Donbas, could probably mean that they will be able to improve their negotiation position. I don't think that the world or the United States is going to accept that they drag their feet until March. I think that something has to happen in the month of February, and that the Russians know that they will have to accept some kind of deal sooner rather than later. But every day that goes by and they have not sat at the table or accepted conditions is, in their view, again a day in which they have made substantial gains.
Mm-hmm. And what message does this sequence of talks send to European allies? That diplomacy can move forward, or that the war remains resistant to any kind of negotiation?
Well, what this message is sending to Europeans very clearly is that we have been advocating for diplomacy and the world of rules and international law. And that is what we are demanding some of our allies to do, for example, in the controversy surrounding Greenland or other things, or the tariff war with the United States. But on the other hand, we are not serious about our own defense. This is fundamental. If Europe, that has the technological capacity, let's not forget that has the economic capacity, we're talking of 160 million people, 27 of the richest, most advanced nations in the world, some of which have very formidable military machines in relation to their population or the size of their countries. I'm talking about countries like Finland or Sweden or Norway or even Denmark that have formidable armies, especially Finland. So what I'm saying here is that either Europe evolves towards a strategic autonomy that President Macron and often, but this is not just about a discourse, this is about action. And we don't have the bureaucracy, the agility to take decisions, and we do not have a military branch of the European Union. We need to consolidate NATO, the transatlantic alliance, because for many years to come, the defense of Europe is not going to be possible without the help and the coordination with our American allies.
Okay, Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us on the program. It's always a pleasure.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
We'll take a break now, and when we return, we'll look at major stories from the region. Stay with us.
And welcome to Primetime. What a show we've got lined up for you. In a complex world, clarity is power. Two hours live, diplomacy dissected in a spin-free environment. That's Prime Time with me, Guy Schoen, weekdays on A News.
Welcome back to A News. Now let's take a closer look at the key stories shaping the region. Azerbaijan State Security Service says it has stopped a planned terrorist attack targeting a foreign embassy in Baku. Officials say several suspects were detained during a security operation.
Azerbaijan State Security Service says it has arrested several people accused of preparing a terrorist attack against the embassy of a foreign country in Baku. Officials say the operation followed intelligence indicating a serious and immediate threat motivated by religious hostility. According to the State Security Service, the suspects had contact with members of the ISIS-linked Vilayat Khorasan group and worked together to obtain items intended for use as weapons. They were detained by security officers while approaching the area where the embassy is located. Authorities say the suspects have been charged with preparing an act of terrorism and placed in pre-trial detention by a court. The State Security Service says investigations are continuing to determine whether others were involved and to rule out any further threats.
US President Donald Trump says that Iran wants to reach a deal with Washington amid the deployment of additional American military assets to the region, including an aircraft carrier strike group.
In an interview with Axios, US President Donald Trump said Tehran has called several times and wants to negotiate a new agreement with the United States. He described the standoff with Iran as a wave, while warning that a large armada is moving into the region. The comments come as the US steps up its military posture. US Central Command confirmed that the USS Abraham Lincoln Aircraft Carrier Strike Group has been deployed to the Middle East, saying the move is intended to ensure regional security and stability. Iranian officials, meanwhile, accuse the United States and Israel of backing armed insurgents and have warned they would respond swiftly and comprehensively to any attack. Inside Iran, the situation continues to deteriorate. Nationwide protests that erupted on December 28th over economic hardship and the collapsing rail have spread across the country. The UN Special Rapporteur on Iran, Mai Sato, says she has received alarming reports of injured protesters being removed from hospitals and detained, a practice she says violates international law by denying access to medical care.
I'm hearing is around $5,000 to $7,000 to get their family members' bodies back. And just to put this in context, this is a huge financial burden for families already living in economic hardship. And what I would add to this is that families, when they go to the morgues, to hospitals to collect their loved ones' remains, they've also been forced to sign documents stating that their family member was actually part of the security force, the member of the Basij, allegedly killed by protesters. And I think if this is true, this practice really compounds grief with extortions.
Human rights groups say the protests are the deadliest since Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution. According to the US-based group Rana, nearly 6,000 people have been killed. Official figures, however, put the death toll at 3,117. As unrest deepens inside Iran and US military forces move closer to its borders, concerns are mounting over stability within the country and across the wider Middle East.
The US Vice President will visit Armenia and Azerbaijan in February to push forward Washington's peace roadmap for the region. Georgia, once a key US partner in the South Caucasus, is not on the agenda, raising questions about its current role and strained ties with Washington. Our correspondent Nini Nikolashvili has more.
The visit of the US Vice President J.D. Vance to Armenia and Azerbaijan in February is officially aimed at advancing the Trump roadmap for international peace and prosperity, or TRIP, with a focus on stabilizing Armenian-Azerbaijan relations and the Zangezur corridor. Georgia, once Washington's closest strategic partner in the South Caucasus, was not included. Prime Minister Irakli Kobakhidze says that the visit is narrowly focused and that Georgia's absence is logical. According to him, the talks center on the Armenian-Azerbaijani peace process and the Zangezur corridor, making Yerevan and Baku the primary addresses. But beyond logistics, the exclusion highlights a broader shift. For years, Georgia positioned itself as the region's most pro-Western state and a key transit hub linking Europe and Asia. Today, as global trade routes are being reassessed and competition over corridors intensifies, Georgia finds itself watching from the sidelines. Georgian Dream lawmakers argue that this is temporary. They say the Zangezur corridor cannot handle projected cargo volumes and that Georgia will remain indispensable as a transport and logistics hub. Officials insist Washington will eventually factor Georgia into its regional planning. Still, the political context matters. Relations between Tbilisi and Washington deteriorated sharply under the Biden administration amid criticism over Democratic backsliding and controversial legislation. The current government says that it is waiting for a reset under President Donald Trump, but acknowledges that trust has not yet been restored. That same tension is visible in Washington. Days before the announced visit, the U.S. Helsinki Commission scheduled a hearing sharply critical of Georgia's human rights record, a move that Tbilisi views as politically motivated and damaging at a time when it is seeking to reset relations with the United States. Nini Nikolashvili, Tbilisi, A-News.
Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan met with his French counterpart Jean-Noël Barrot in Ankara. The talks covered trade, security cooperation and regional issues, including Gaza and Syria. The ministers also addressed the welfare of the Turkish community in France, counter-terrorism cooperation, defence industry ties, trade and Turkey's relations with the European Union. Turkey continues its diplomatic push to help end the conflict in Gaza. Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan has met with senior officials from Hamas in Istanbul as part of ongoing efforts to support the ceasefire and the humanitarian response.
Turkey's Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan met with a Hamas delegation on Monday in Istanbul, according to sources from the Turkish Foreign Ministry. The talks focused on the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire plan, the worsening humanitarian situation in the enclave, and broader regional developments. Foreign Minister Fidan reportedly briefed the delegation on Turkey's diplomatic efforts, including its role in the newly formed Board of Peace, a multilateral platform purportedly aimed at ensuring the rights of Palestinians in Gaza. At the meeting, Fidan reportedly stressed that Ankara remains committed to ensuring a steady flow of humanitarian aid into the war-torn region. The current ceasefire agreement, which took effect last October, calls for Hamas and other Palestinian groups to disarm, an additional Israeli withdrawal, and the commencement of large-scale reconstruction efforts. The Board of Peace was announced earlier this month by U.S. President Donald Trump and has been endorsed by the UN Security Council. On Sunday, the Hamas delegation also held talks with Turkish intelligence chief Ibrahim Kalin in Istanbul. This is Adam Mara for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
A new report by the New York Times says negotiations between the United States and the Taliban over American detainees have reached a deadlock, despite Kabul saying it's ready to release US prisoners. Our correspondent Tamim Bahis has more from Kabul.
For months, US and Afghan officials have been holding secret negotiations aimed at securing the release of remaining American detainees in Afghanistan, a key priority for President Trump and a condition for any further diplomatic engagement with the Taliban. However, according to the New York Times, the talks have stalled due to disagreements over who should be freed. Taliban officials say they are prepared to release 2 American detainees, but are demanding that the case of the last Afghan prisoner held at Guantanamo Bay be addressed as part of any deal. That prisoner, Mohammad Rahim, is accused of links to Al-Qaeda and has been held at Guantanamo since 2008 without formal charges. The United States, meanwhile, is insisting that at least 3 Americans should be released, including Mahmoud Habibi, whom Washington say was detained in Afghanistan in 2022. Kabul denies holding Habibi for leverage, while Afghanistan's foreign minister has told the New York Times that Kabul is not engaging in hostage diplomacy and is seeking broader progress in relations with Washington. The U.S. State Department rejects that position and is calling for the immediate release of all Americans detained in Afghanistan. The report adds that recent security incidents and political tensions have further complicated negotiations, leaving the fate of the remaining detainees uncertain. Tamim Bahis in Kabul, A News.
Now we'll take a short break, and right after we'll discuss Iran's deadly protest crackdown and rising regional tensions. We'll see you then. Welcome back to A News. Tensions are rising in and around the Middle East as heated protests continue in Iran and the United States expand sanctions on Iranian oil shipments and related vessels. Meanwhile, airlines are rerouting or cancelling flights to the region, and US military assets, including naval and air force units, are being repositioned amid growing concerns about security and retaliation. To discuss this further, let's bring in our guest, Bekir İlhan from the Turkey Research Foundation, joining us from Ankara, Turkey. Bekir, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the US has sanctioned 9 vessels involved in Iranian oil shipments. How significant are these measures in terms of their impact on Iran's economy and Tehran's calculation toward the protests and external pressure?
Yeah, we need to say that Iran is a heavily sanctioned country. It's been a long time for Iran to suffer such an international sanction led by the United States. And what we've seen in the streets right now are in fact an outcome of these sanctions, And of course, there are some societal costs and there are some economic consequences due to these sanctions. But right now, there seems to be no political outcome, because of course the Iranian economy is dependent on the oil industry. The oil revenues are a vital part of the Iranian economy, the Iranian governments, because many people in Iran lives on government subsidies and they run their business, they live their lives on the government funds, and the ability of the regime to provide public goods, has decreased due to these sanctions. And there was GDP decline in Iran, revenue decline, currency crash, and at the end of the day, we are seeing these protests on the streets. But like I said, yes, there are economic and societal consequences, but there is no political outcome yet because the regime itself is strongly standing there. Yes, it has lost credibility, it has lost some capacity, it has lost some legitimacy, but at the end of the day, it still stands firm right now. And there is no significant sign in the regime right now, in the short term for kind of a collapse, because there is revolutionary guard in Iran, they are still there, and there is no any kind of division among them. There is no elite rift, there is no elite split right now. And I would say for sure the additional sanctions will also have bad impacts on the Iranian economy, but I'm not sure if there will be immediate political outcomes due to these sanctions.
And Bekir, we know now that major airlines are rerouting flights and cancelling routes to the Middle East. What does that say about how global carriers are assessing risk? And how might this disruption affect economies and civilians, both in the region and abroad?
First of all, these kind of activities, at some point we can say that it's a clear sign of a U.S. military action, but at the end of the day, we are talking about economic companies, and of course they do not want to take risk, and they just cancel their flights and they just cancel their economic activities regarding the Iran, and for sure it will also, damage the Iranian economy. Iran is also an isolated country, is isolated from the international system, and it has this limited access to the international markets, international economic activities. And like I said, such events, flight cancellations or the loss of economic activity will also, weaken the Iranian economy. But like I said, yes, the Iranian people will suffer, the Iranian economy will suffer, but at the end of the day, I don't think that there will be, a political outcome regarding the regime change in Iran.
And with reports now that the US Navy and Air Force assets are moving to the Middle East, how does this positioning affect the risk of broader confrontation?
Yeah, the United States is capable of conducting a military operation in Iran. It has the capacity to do so. But right now, I think the most of the calculation is based on the political outcomes, I would say, for sure. If the United States wants to, change the regime in Iran, I would say they will do it easily, given their military might and given their military activity in their region, I would say. And I think that Iran will have no chance of defense itself against enormous American military power, I can say that. But the issue here is not a military issue, I would say. It's just a political issue, I would say, because the United States still calculating the political risks of such a regime change operation, I would say. Of course, the United States can conduct some punitive military strikes on Iranian security facilities or on Iranian ballistic facilities. It could be a limited attack, but there is also a possibility of a regime change attack. And I would say the United States has the capacity to do so, but right now it's a matter of political will. The Trump administration, I would say right now, is calculating the post-regime change outcomes in Iran, because Iran is a very diverse country, is a very, fragmented country, it has a, vast geography, and, it's not easy to control Iran after the regime change right now. And as I said, the main reason for the United States, the main focus point for the United States is the post-regime change outcomes, I would say. Other than that, like I said, the military option for the United States is the easiest thing.
Okay, and finally, Bekir, is there any serious diplomatic channels still open between Washington and Tehran that could slow this spiral, or are we seeing hardening on both sides?
Yeah, maybe there might be some backdoor diplomatic contacts, and maybe some neighboring countries, Gulf countries or other regional countries, could mediate between the United States and the Iranian regime right now. Of course, there is no public sign for that, but like I said, there might be some backdoor diplomatic contacts. And of course, just looking at the broader regional politics, I would say most of the countries in the region will not benefit a regime change operation in Iran, because a fragmented Iran, a disrupted Iran will cause more instability, will cause more, political risk for the neighboring countries like Turkey, like Iraq, like Gulf countries. And like I said, the regional countries have also their interest in stopping the United States to conduct such a regime change operation in Iran, I would say. And also it's likely that it wouldn't surprise me if there are some backdoor diplomatic mediation efforts between Iran and the United States.
Okay, Bekir, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate your insight.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You're up to date with World News for the hour. Thank you for watching and stay tuned to A News.